Charlie Chaplin had 2 honorary Oscars, a knighthood, and a face that Time magazine called the most famous on earth. But behind the man who made the world laugh was a father whose own children barely knew him, uprooted by government exile, raised in the shadow of a legend, and left to build lives from whatever that name left them. A son who died at 42, his alcoholism tracing directly back to a childhood spent as a legal pawn in his parents' divorce. A daughter who walked away from acting to spend 50 years quietly managing her father's memory so the rest of the world could keep loving him. A son who ran away from the Swiss estate as a teenager and came back asking questions his father never had the courage to ask. And the youngest, born when his father was 73, whose clearest memory of the most famous comedian who ever lived was an old man staring across the dinner table, unable to speak. This is the story almost nobody tells in full. Who Chaplin really was. The wound before the fame. To understand the 8 children Charlie Chaplin raised with Una O'Neill, you first have to understand the man who raised them, not the icon, but the boy he had been 60 years before any of them were born. Charles Spencer Chaplin was born on April 16, 1889, in Kennington, South London, into poverty so severe that it shaped everything he ever made. His father was a music hall performer who abandoned the family early and drank himself to death at 38. His mother, Hannah, was a singer whose voice gave out on stage one night when Charlie was 5 years old, so suddenly and so completely that the stage manager spotted the boy standing in the wings and led him out to fill the silence. That was Charlie Chaplin's first performance, a 5-year-old stepping into his mother's collapsed career to keep the audience from leaving. Hannah's mental health deteriorated throughout his childhood. She was committed to Cane Hill Asylum in 1898. Charlie was 9. He and his half-brother Sidney were sent briefly to live with their father, who was by then severely alcoholic, living in conditions poor enough to attract a visit from the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. Charlie was sent to the workhouse twice before the age of 9. When he was 14, his mother was committed permanently. He lived alone for several days afterward, searching for food and occasionally sleeping rough, until Sidney came home. What this childhood produced was a man of extraordinary empathy and extraordinary remove. He understood poverty and abandonment and humiliation so completely that he could put them on screen in ways that made audiences across the world laugh and cry at the same time. But he was also a man who had learned very early that the people you love disappear. That lesson stayed with him longer than any of his films did. He married 4 times. His first 3 marriages were disasters, bitter, acrimonious, and very public. He married his first wife, 16-year-old Mildred Harris, in 1918 after she believed she was pregnant. It was a false alarm. They later had a son, Norman, who lived for only 3 days. His second wife, Lita Gray, was 15 when he began his relationship with her. Their divorce produced 2 sons, Charles Jr. and Sidney, and a public legal battle so vicious and so detailed that it nearly destroyed his reputation. By the time he met Una O'Neill in 1942, Chaplin was 53 years old, under FBI surveillance, embroiled in a paternity lawsuit brought by a woman named Joan Barry, and widely considered by significant sections of the American public to be a moral degenerate and a probable communist. Una was 18. She was the daughter of Eugene O'Neill, the Nobel Prize-winning playwright, who was so furious at the relationship that he disinherited her. They married in June 1943. Nobody believed it would last. It lasted 34 years until his death. For the last 20 years I have known what happiness means, Chaplin wrote in his memoirs. As I live with Una, The depth and beauty of her character are a continual revelation to me. Together they had 8 children, and the world those children were born into, the surveillance, the scandal, the exile, the extraordinary Swiss estate where their father spent the last 25 years of his life, is the world that shaped all of them. The Exile: How a Government Decision Changed 8 Childhoods. Before a single one of the 8 Una children's stories can be told properly, one event has to be understood. Because it is the event that divided their childhoods in 2, before and after, and whose effects rippled through every arc that follows. On September 17, 1952, Charlie Chaplin, Una, and their 4 oldest children, Geraldine, Michael, Josephine, and Victoria, boarded the RMS Queen Elizabeth in New York, bound for London. Chaplin was going to attend the world premiere of his film, Limelight. He had a valid re-entry permit. He expected to be back home in Hollywood within weeks. One day out of New York, while the family was on the ocean, the United States Attorney General James McGranary issued a public statement revoking Chaplin's re-entry permit. He would be barred from the United States unless he submitted to an immigration hearing concerning his morality and political views. McGranary called Chaplin a menace to womanhood. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI had been building a file on him for 12 years, a file that eventually ran to over 2,000 pages. The file contained, among other things, the conclusion that Chaplin had never been a member of the Communist Party, had never donated money to communist causes, and paid his taxes. None of that had made any difference. Chaplin received the news by telegram on the ship and made a private decision. He would not return. He would not submit to a hearing conducted by people who had already decided the verdict. He had lived in America for 40 years, had built his entire career there, had become one of the most famous men in the world there. And now a press release issued while he was at sea told him he was no longer welcome. He was 63 years old. Una was 27. Their 4 oldest children were under 9. Eugene, Jane, Annette, and Christopher had not yet been born. Una flew back to Los Angeles alone that autumn, a young mother of 4, to close down their life in America. She recovered her husband's money, which he had buried in the backyard, a detail that tells you everything about how much he had trusted the institutions around him, converted it to $1,000 bills, and sewed them into her mink coat. She said goodbye to the country she had grown up in and flew back to Europe. In early 1953, the family moved permanently to Manoir de Bar, a 32-room estate in the Swiss village of Corsier-sur-Vevey. The 4 younger children would be born there. All 8 would grow up there, and all 8 would carry, in their own way, the weight of being the children of a man who had been expelled from the country that made him famous because that country decided he was dangerous. Charles Jr., the son who carried the name and lost the fight. Before the 8 Una children, there was Charles Spencer Chaplin Jr., born May 5, 1925, to Chaplin's second wife, Lita Gray. He is not one of the 8 this video is primarily about. But his story cannot be left out, because it is the story that casts a shadow over all the others. It is what happens when a child is handed a name too large to carry, and no one helps him put it down. As young children, Charles Jr. and his brother Sidney were used as pawns in their mother's bitter divorce proceedings from Chaplin. A legal battle so public and so vicious that Lita's lawyers submitted a document detailing Chaplin's private behavior that was so sensational it was read aloud in courtrooms and sold as a pamphlet on the street. The brothers grew up in the custody of their mother and grandmother, visiting their father on weekends, admiring him but unable to reach him. After the war, Charles Jr. came to Hollywood determined to be an actor. His father gave him and Sidney small roles in Limelight in 1952. Though Sidney's role was significantly larger, billed just below Buster Keaton, while Charles Jr. appeared briefly as an uncredited clown. That detail, the uncredited clown, while his brother stood in the credits above legends, says something about what it felt like to stand in that particular shadow. He appeared in a string of B-movies through the 1950s. He wrote a book about his father in 1960, generous and clear-eyed, that painted a portrait of a man who was well-meaning but often absent. He descended, as his mother had, into alcoholism. His friendships thinned. His health deteriorated. On March 20th, 1968, Charles Spencer Chaplin Jr. died of a pulmonary embolism in Santa Monica, California. He was 42 years old. He is buried at Hollywood Forever Cemetery alongside his maternal grandmother. His father, living in Switzerland, outlived him by 9 years. Geraldine, the daughter who made it on her own terms. Geraldine Lee Chaplin was born on July 31, 1944, the first child of Charlie and Una, and the first of the 8. She grew up first in Beverly Hills, and then, after the exile, in Switzerland, a childhood she has described as protected, loving, and intensely shaped by the presence of a father who was already old by the time she could form memories of him. She attended the Royal Ballet Academy in London, training as a dancer rather than an actress. It was in Paris, while she was dancing, that director David Lean spotted her and offered her the role of Tanya in Dr. Zhivago in 1965. She was 21 years old. The film was one of the most successful of the decade. It made her a working actress of genuine standing, not a celebrity daughter on a borrowed platform, but a professional in her own right. What followed was a career of striking range and persistence. She appeared in Robert Altman's Nashville in 1975. She played her own grandmother Hannah in Richard Attenborough's 1992 biopic Chaplin, a casting decision of remarkable emotional complexity. The granddaughter of the woman whose mental collapse had shaped her own father's entire inner life, standing in for that woman on screen. She had 3 Golden Globe nominations. She has continued working into her 80s. Her daughter Una, named for her mother, became an actress as well, most recognizably as Talisa Stark in Game of Thrones. The Chaplin acting legacy is now 3 generations deep on Geraldine's branch alone. But what is striking about Geraldine's story, in the context of what the name Chaplin cost so many of the people who carried it, is that she built something entirely her own. She did not try to be her father. She did not perform the tramp's shadow. She found her own voice in a different kind of cinema and spent 6 decades making it ring. Michael, the son who ran away and came back different. Michael John Chaplin was born on March 7, 1946, the first son of Charlie and Una and the second of the 8. He made his screen debut at 6 years old, a brief appearance in Limelight, and then in A King in New York at age 11, playing a boy whose parents are targeted by the FBI. His father had written the character based on his own experience of being pursued by exactly that organization. It was not a subtle casting choice. Michael's impression of his father, recalled in later interviews, was of someone amazingly wealthy, intermittently caring, but often removed and intimidating. The family staff, the tutors, the household workers, were closer to Michael than his father was. His half-brother Sidney, from Chaplin's second marriage, was closer still. The world of Manoir de Ban was gilded and enclosed and, for a certain kind of boy, suffocating. He ran away from home as a teenager. He found his way back. He married twice, first to writer Patrice Johns, then to painter Patricia Betaudier. And between those 2 marriages, he raised 7 children. He has lived quietly in Switzerland for decades. He wrote a novel, A Fallen God, and with his daughters Carmen and Dolores, he made a documentary, Chaplin, Spirit of the Tramp, exploring the Romany heritage in his father's background that had been suppressed and quietly denied for much of his father's life. There is something quietly powerful about that documentary. Charlie Chaplin spent his entire public life in America being called a communist, a subversive, a man whose loyalties could not be trusted. Part of what drove those accusations was the persistent rumor, confirmed more thoroughly after his death, that he had Romani ancestry, which placed him outside the category of Englishman or American that his accusers wanted him to fit into. His son, 60 years later, made a film specifically to recover and honor that heritage. It is a different kind of response to a father's legacy than most children of icons manage, not performance, excavation. Victoria, the daughter who joined the circus. Victoria Agnes Chaplin was born on May 19, 1951, the fourth of the 8. By the time she was old enough to think about her future, the family was settled in Switzerland, and her father was in his 60s. She was raised in a household shaped by art, music, and an understanding that performance was not a hobby, but a vocation. It would have been the easiest and most predictable thing in the world for her to become an actress. Instead, she became a circus clown. In 1969, 18-year-old Victoria eloped with a French actor named Jean-Baptiste Thierry. What the two of them built together is one of the more unexpected stories in the entire Chaplin family. They appeared together as clowns in Federico Fellini's film The Clowns in 1970, a cameo that said everything about what they were choosing to become. They then created their own circus, Le Cirque Bonjour, performing together as professional clowns across Europe. Their two children, Aurelia and James, became celebrated circus performers and dancers in their own right. Victoria has spent her adult life in a tent, on a stage, under lights. Not the Hollywood kind, but the kind that travel with a circus from city to city, that exist for a single night, and then move on. It is a life that would have baffled and probably delighted her father, who spent his childhood dreaming of stages and ended up building a career on the comedy of a man who never quite fit anywhere. Eugene, Jane, Annette, and Christopher, the Swiss children. The 4 youngest of Una's 8 were born in Switzerland after the exile in the house at Corsier-sur-Vevey that their parents would never fully leave. They grew up knowing their father as an elderly man, increasingly frail, increasingly remote, the strokes of the 1970s gradually stealing his speech and his memory before the end. Eugene Anthony Chaplin, born August 23, 1953, went to the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts as a stage manager and ended up not on stage but in recording studios. He worked as a recording engineer for the Rolling Stones, David Bowie, and Queen. But the project that tells you most about him is not any of those sessions. It is the musical he created called Smile, a narration of his father's entire life told entirely through the music Chaplin himself had composed. Not through dialogue, not through biography, but through melody. A son who could not speak to his father through words found a way to speak to the world through his father's own notes. He has 7 children and lives in Switzerland. Jane Cecil Chaplin, born May 23, 1957, worked in New York and Orlando with directors including Milos Forman before moving to Columbia in 2002 to write screenplays. In 2006, she published a biography of her father. She called it 17 Minutes with My Father. Not an hour, not an afternoon, 17 minutes. That title is not a complaint. It is a precise and devastating account of what was actually available to her, and she had the courage to name it honestly rather than inflate it into something warmer than the truth. Annette Emily Chaplin, born December 3, 1959, is the most private of all the Chaplin children. She raises and rides Arabian thoroughbreds in France and Switzerland. She and her husband took an old grain silo and converted it into a working theater, a space that didn't exist before they decided it should. She runs it herself, staging local productions, hosting festivals. There is something in that image, a Chaplin child turning an empty industrial structure into a place where people come to watch stories, that feels like inheritance expressed in the quietest possible way. Christopher James Chaplin was born on July 6, 1962, when his father was 73 years old. The age gap alone tells most of the story. By the time Christopher was old enough to sit across the dinner table and have a real conversation, the strokes had already begun their work. His most vivid memories of the most famous comedian in the history of cinema were of a frail old man who could no longer speak, staring across at him in the evenings, unable to cross the distance between them. Charlie Chaplin died on Christmas Day, 1977. Christopher was 15. He grew up to become a composer and experimental musician in London, making orchestral and electronic work in a world as far from Hollywood as it is possible to get, while still carrying the same name. Christopher once told an interviewer that he and Victoria meet monthly in Paris to manage the business and financial matters related to their father's legacy. And once, passing a restaurant in Sweden that had a doll of his father in the window, he looked at it and said, "They have not paid me for this." It was said with a smile, but it was not entirely a joke. What the name built and what it cost. There is a detail in Josephine Hannah Chaplin's story that deserves its own moment. Josephine, born March 28, 1949, became an actress, appearing in Limelight, in Pasolini's Canterbury Tales, and a handful of other films, and then quietly stepped away from performance to live in Paris, where she managed the Chaplin office and kept the legacy running from the inside. She sponsored a statue of the Little Tramp in Waterville, Ireland. She was married twice, had 3 sons, and died in Paris on July 13, 2023, aged 74. She spent her life maintaining the machinery of her father's memory so that the rest of the world could continue to love him. That is its own kind of quiet sacrifice. It is the thing the most devoted child of a famous parent often ends up doing, not building a life of their own in the spotlight, but tending the monument so that others can visit it. What all 8 of Una's children share, and what separates them strikingly from the children of Chaplin's earlier marriages, is stability. Not ease, not simplicity, but stability. They had a mother who gave up everything to give it to them. Una O'Neill, daughter of a Nobel laureate, debutante of the year in New York in 1942, a young woman with every reason to pursue her own ambitions, chose instead to be completely present for her children in a Swiss estate while her husband aged, and the world outside continued to decide who he had been. After Chaplin died in 1977, she became increasingly reclusive. She drank. She died of pancreatic cancer on September 27, 1991, at the age of 66. Her daughter Geraldine named her own daughter Una in her memory. Charlie Chaplin died on Christmas Day, 1977, at Manoir de Ban. He was 88 years old. He was knighted in 1975, a ceremony during which he famously could not rise from his chair and had to receive the honor seated. He had returned to America only once after the exile, in 1972, to accept an honorary Oscar from an industry that had been largely silent when his country threw him out 20 years earlier. The standing ovation lasted 12 minutes. His ashes were stolen from his grave by 2 men who demanded ransom and were caught 11 weeks later. The ashes were recovered and reburied under concrete to prevent it happening again. Even in death, the world could not leave him alone. What they carry. Charlie Chaplin's children are his most complicated legacy. Not the films, as extraordinary as they are, not the tramp, as immortal as he remains. The children, all of them, the ones from the early chaotic marriages and the 8 from the quiet Swiss years are the most honest account of who he actually was. Charles Jr. died at 42 with an alcoholism that traced directly back to a childhood spent as a legal pawn. Sidney Jr. found his own success and outlived his brother by 40 years. Geraldine built a career in which she was never just her father's daughter. Michael ran away and came home with questions his father had never been brave enough to ask. Victoria ran away and joined the circus and never looked back. Eugene engineered music for the Rolling Stones. Jane wrote a book called 17 Minutes with My Father. Annette converted a silo into a theater. Christopher was 15 when the old man at the dinner table finally went quiet. And Josephine, who spent her life managing the office, maintaining the flame, answering the correspondence, died in Paris at 74, the keeper of a legacy she had never asked for but had honored for decades with everything she had. Charlie Chaplin once said that all he needed to make a comedy was a park, a policeman, and a pretty girl. What he needed to make a family turned out to be considerably more complicated than that. He had a genius for putting the small man's struggle on screen in ways that made the world recognize itself. He was less gifted at the harder, quieter work of being present for the small people who shared his name. But they survived him. Most of them built something real. And the ones who are still living are still building, in studios in London, in theaters in the French countryside, in Swiss estates, where the photographs of a famous father line every wall, and in the monthly meetings in Paris, where 2 of his children sit down together to decide what his memory is worth. That is what it means to be Charlie Chaplin's children. Not the glamour, not the legend, the monthly meeting in Paris, the silo converted into a theater, the book called 17 Minutes with My Father, the legacy tended quietly by the people who knew him best and loved him in spite of it. If you found this story worth your time, please like and subscribe so you never miss another one.